She was 41 years old when the county auctioneer's gavel came down and the crowd around her dissolved into laughter, and she was alone in a field of dry Colorado grass with the deed to the most ruined building in Caldwell Flats pressed against her chest like a wound. Her name was Nora Holt, and she had arrived at that auction with $11.60, the last of what remained after the bank in Denver had swallowed her husband's debts and the creditors had stripped the house to its baseboards and the drought had finished the rest. $11.60 for a derelict saloon that no one else wanted, the Glass Meridian they called it once, a two-story husk on the eastern edge of a dying town, its windows boarded, its sign long since rotted to splinters, the whole of it listing gently toward the earth as though it had already made up its mind to return there. The men who laughed were laughing because they knew something she did not. Or so they believed. What was sealed beneath the warped floorboards of that forgotten building, hidden by a woman whose name had been deliberately erased from every public record in the territory, would not merely change Nora Holt's life. It would restore an entire town's memory of itself and deliver, in the quiet patient way that justice sometimes prefers, exactly what was owed to those who had been robbed in the open light of day. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Nora Holt. If you are watching this from a place that feels forgotten, a town the maps have started to ignore, a life others have decided is past its value, we would love for you to tell us about it in the comments below. She had not always been a woman arriving at auctions with $11. There had been a time, not so very long before, when Nora Perch, as she was known in her maiden years, had moved through the world with the particular confidence of someone who had been taught, early and well, that a person's worth was measured in what they could make with their own two hands. Her father, Emmett Perch, had been a cabinetmaker in the town of Laramie, Wyoming, a man of almost ceremonial patience who had come west from Pennsylvania with nothing but a set of chisels and an understanding of wood so intimate it bordered on the spiritual. He could look at a plank of green pine and tell you what it would do in 10 years' time, how it would warp in summer and pull tight in the cold, which grain would hold a joint and which would split under pressure. He taught Nora everything he knew, not because he lacked sons, he had two, but because he recognized in his middle daughter a quality of attention that the boys simply did not possess. She was the one who sat beside him at the workbench for hours without speaking, watching the way a plane moved across with the way other children watched rivers. She was the one who understood, before he ever told her, that a good piece of furniture was not merely an object but a kind of argument, an argument that someone had cared enough to do a thing properly, and that the world was better for careful things than careless ones. By the time she was 14 she could join dovetails as cleanly as her father. By 16 she could read a warped floor and know whether it had settled or whether something below it had shifted and needed attention. Her father called this skill floor reading, and he said it in the same tone he used for Bible verses, as though it were a form of literacy that the world undervalued at its peril. You had to press your palm flat against the boards, he explained. You had to feel for the flex and the hollow, for the give that meant rot and the resistance that meant sound timber. You had to listen, too, to the creak that told you a joist had pulled loose from its bearing, to the silence that told you the substructure was solid as the day it was laid. Nora carried this education the way some women carry needlework or hymns, quietly and everywhere. She married Franklin Holt when she was 23. He was a civil surveyor with ambitions toward land speculation, a tall, pleasant man whose confidence in his own future was so complete and so cheerfully expressed that it was easy, in those early years, to mistake it for competence. He was not a dishonest man, not precisely. He was simply a man who consistently believed that the next deal would be the one that corrected all the errors of the previous deals, and that this belief, maintained with sufficient enthusiasm, constituted a plan. Nora had learned enough from her father to know that enthusiasm was not a substitute for measurement, but she loved Franklin, and love is patient with the things it cannot change. They settled first in Cheyenne, then in a small house outside Denver when the surveying work moved southward. They had no children, which was a grief they carried together without much spoken acknowledgement of it, the way long married people learn to carry such things. Nora kept a workshop in the back of their property where she repaired furniture for neighbors and, over the years, built a small reputation as a woman who could resurrect things others had given up on. It was that reputation, she would later think, that had been the truest thing about her life in Denver. Not the house, which was Franklin's name on the deed. Not the social standing, which depended on Franklin's business connections. Not any of the fragile structures that a marriage builds without either partner quite noticing how much of the foundation belongs to only one of them. The truest thing was the work she did in that back workshop, alone with the smell of linseed oil and sawdust, making broken things whole again. Franklin died in the autumn of 1883, and he died owing money to 11 different men, a fact that emerged over the following weeks the way floodwater emerges, slowly at first, then all at once, and then everywhere. The debts were the residue of a land speculation scheme that had seemed, on paper, like a reasonable gamble with other people's money, though by the time the lawyers were finished explaining it to Nora the distinction between a reasonable gamble and a simple theft of other people's futures had blurred considerably. She did not have the temperament for bitterness, and she did not have the time. The bank moved first on the house. The largest creditor, a Denver businessman named Aldous Crane, moved next on everything inside it, the furniture, the workshop tools, a small set of silver that had belonged to her mother, even the hand plane her father had given her the year before he died. Crane's men came on a Tuesday morning in March of 1884, and they were methodical and not unkind about it, which she found, somehow, worse than if they had been cruel. Cruelty would have given her something to push against. Methodical indifference simply left her standing in an empty house watching dust motes settle on the bare floor where her workbench used to be. She had $11.60. She had a winter coat. She had a carpet bag with 3 changes of clothing, a small Bible, and a folding rule that had belonged to her father and that Crane's men had somehow overlooked in their inventory, tucked as it was inside the lining pocket of her second-best skirt. She did not know, in those first days, where she was going. She took the train south and then west simply because the ticket cost less than the ticket going east, and frugality, in the absence of any other compass, was at least a direction. She came off the train in a town called Ridgeway and then moved by wagon to a smaller settlement and then by foot along a dry creek bed to the outskirts of Caldwell Flats, which was itself small enough and tired enough to feel like the end of something. Caldwell Flats, Colorado, in the spring of 1884, was a town in the particular late stage of Western settlement that the newspapers back east never wrote about, past the drama of its founding, past the brief prosperity of the silver strike nearby that had given it reason to exist, and deep into the long slow question of whether it had enough reason to continue. The population had contracted from its peak of perhaps 800 souls to something closer to 200. Several buildings on the main street stood empty. The hotel operated at 1/3 of its capacity. The school had consolidated its 2 rooms into one. The people who remained were the ones who had built something real enough to make leaving feel like a second failure, ranchers with land, a blacksmith with a forge, a dry goods merchant with a family, a doctor who stayed because the nearest other doctor was 3 days' ride. They were decent people engaged in the difficult business of maintaining dignity in reduced circumstances, which is perhaps the most demanding kind of dignity there is. The Glass Meridian Saloon had been closed for 6 years when the county put it up for public auction on a warm Friday morning in April. Nora had seen the notice posted at the dry goods store and had read it twice, her folding rule pressing against her hip through the skirt fabric. She had been sleeping in a lean-to behind the livery for 4 nights, performing small repairs in exchange for the space, and she was beginning to understand that $11.60 was not a number that sustained a life for very long. The auction notice described the property as approximately 1,400 square feet on a single lot, 2-story construction, partial roof failure on the north end, no functioning water source on premises. The opening bid was set at $8, which the auctioneer clearly intended as a formality, a floor below which no reasonable offer would sink. She was the only bidder. The crowd that gathered, perhaps 20 men from town, a few curious women at the edge, had come, she understood later, less from any expectation of commerce than from the entertainment of watching what would happen when the county tried to sell the unsellable. They had watched the Glass Meridian decay for 6 years. They had watched the roof sag and the siding bleach and the front steps rot through. They knew what she could not have known, which was that the building had a history so tangled that no local man would touch it, and that history had nothing to do with the structure itself and everything to do with what had happened inside it. When the auctioneer called the opening bid and Nora Holt raised her hand and said $8.50, the laughter that followed was not entirely unkind. It was the laughter of people who assumed she did not understand what she was doing. She paid $11.10 all told, the bid, plus the county's recording fee, and folded the deed into her Bible beside the ribbon marker, and walked to the glass meridian alone while the crowd dispersed behind her. The building smelled of old bourbon and mouse and the particular dry rot that sets in when a wood-frame structure is left without ventilation for years in an arid climate. She stood inside the front door, which she'd had to shoulder open because the frame had swayed enough to bind the latch, and she let her eyes adjust to the dimness that came through the gaps in the boarded windows. The bar was still there, a long counter of what had once been fine walnut, now gray with dust and warped along its length in a slow curve that spoke of years of moisture and then years of drought cycling through the wood. The mirror behind it had shattered at some point and been left in place, its pieces still held in the frame by old putty, so that the reflection it returned was fractured into a dozen incomplete versions of the room. Several tables remained, their chairs either missing or stacked in corners at angles that suggested they'd been placed there in haste. The staircase to the second floor had lost 2 treads near the top. The ceiling was intact over most of the room but had failed completely in the back corner, letting in a column of daylight and, over the years, a great deal of rain. She did not stand in the middle of the room and feel despair, though perhaps another person would have. What she felt, pressing her palm flat against the bar top the way her father had taught her to press it against any which she was assessing, was something more like readiness. A ruined thing was simply a thing that had not yet met the right person. She had spent 20 years making that argument with her hands, and she was prepared to make it again here. It was when she began walking the perimeter of the room, assessing the floor, the first order of business in any structure, her father had always said, because the floor was the foundation of everything that happened above it, that she found the first clue. The boards near the bar were solid, older growth pine laid close and still tight despite the years. Moving toward the center of the room the flex increased, which was consistent with a weakened joist below, something she could address. But in the far left corner, behind where a piano would once have stood, she could see the 4 indentations in the floor where the casters had rested. The sound the boards returned to her footstep was wrong. Not the soft thud of rot. Not the slight resonance of a weakened joist. A hollow sound. A deliberate hollow sound, the kind that comes not from decay but from design. She pressed both palms to the floor and closed her eyes the way her father had taught her. She spread her fingers and felt the wood. The boards here were the same pine, the same width, but they had been laid from a different direction than the rest of the floor. She could feel it in the grain under her fingertips, the fibers running east to west rather than north to south like the surrounding boards. And when she moved her hands carefully along the edge of the section, she found what her father had taught her to call a false seam, a join that looked like an ordinary floor seam but was in fact a concealed edge, cut clean and fitted so precisely that years of dust had simply settled into it and made it invisible. Someone had built this deliberately. Someone who knew exactly what they were doing had constructed a hidden compartment beneath this floor and had taken considerable care that it would not be found by anyone who did not know how to look. Nora sat back on her heels in the dimness of the abandoned saloon she had just purchased for $11.10, and she felt the particular stillness that comes when you realize the world has just changed shape around you, quietly and without announcement. She did not open it that afternoon. Her father had taught her patience as seriously as he had taught her joinery. She spent the remaining daylight hours walking the entire structure, assessing what she had, what she needed, what could be saved and what would need to come out entirely. She noted the roof failure and calculated, approximately, what lumber would be required to patch it. She found that the staircase treads, though missing, had left their stringers intact and solid. She discovered that the second floor, accessible via a ladder she found in the back room, was in considerably better condition than the lower. The roof failure had concentrated at the rear of the ground level, and the upper story had escaped largely unscathed. There were 4 rooms above, small but dry, their windows boarded but their floors level and their plaster walls cracked but standing. One of those rooms could shelter her while she worked. She went to the dry goods store before it closed and spent her remaining 50 cents on a pound of dried beans, a small sack of cornmeal, and a box of matches. She came back to the glass meridian in the early evening light and climbed to the room that would be hers and lay down on the bare floor in her winter coat and looked at the ceiling and thought about her father and about false floors and about the nature of hidden things. It took her 3 days to open the compartment properly. This was not hesitation, it was preparation. She wanted tools, or what passed for tools without money to buy them. She traded 2 days of labor patching the livery's fence for a short pry bar and an old wood chisel, explaining to the liveryman that she was making repairs to her new property. He looked at her as though she had announced she was building a ship in the desert, but he provided the tools without comment, and she returned them both the morning she was done with them. The compartment opened from the west edge of the false section, the pry bar finding the gap she'd already identified with her fingers and the boards lifting cleanly once the hidden latch, a simple wooden toggle mounted flush beneath the surface, was released by the chisel. The section came up in 4 connected planks, hinged along the north edge she had not at first identified, and when the light from the lantern she'd borrowed fell into the space below her hands, she understood that she was looking at something that had been placed here with tremendous care and considerable purpose. The compartment was perhaps 3 feet wide, 4 feet long, and 18 inches deep, set between 2 floor joists that had been trimmed and reinforced specifically to accommodate it. It was dry, whoever had built it had understood the importance of keeping moisture away from what was stored here, and had lined the interior with sheets of tin salvaged from food cans, soldered together at the seams into a rough but effective barrier. And what the space contained, resting on a folded piece of oilcloth, was a leather satchel of the kind that traveling merchants used to carry account books, fastened with 2 brass clasps that had gone green but held firm, and beside it a smaller cloth bundle tied with twine, and beside that, wrapped in more oilcloth, a flat wooden case of the kind used for legal documents. She sat back. She did not reach for any of it. She looked at it for a long moment and breathed slowly, the way her father had breathed when a piece of wood he'd been working for weeks finally told him what it wanted to become. Then she reached in and lifted out the leather satchel first, because it was the heaviest and because weight, her father had said, usually indicated where the important things were. The satchel contained 3 account books. They were cloth-bound ledgers of the standard type used by merchants throughout the territory, and they were filled, front to back, in a small, precise, and entirely feminine hand, with columns of figures and dates and names. The dates ran from 1871 to 1878. The names, and there were dozens of them, filling every page, were the names of people in Caldwell Flats. Nora did not know most of them, having been in the town less than 2 weeks, but she recognized several: the dry goods merchant, whose name appeared on a sign she passed each day, the name of the blacksmith, the name of a rancher who had nodded to her once from across the street. Against each name were figures, amounts paid, amounts received, and in a separate column, a notation that Nora initially could not decipher, a small symbol that looked like a compressed letter or a private mark. It took her the better part of the afternoon, working through the books by the light of the open compartment, to understand what the mark signified. When she understood it, she sat very still for a long time. The cloth bundle contained letters. 43 of them, she would eventually count, bound in order of their dates, running from the spring of 1876 through the winter of 1878. They were written to a woman named Cecilia Marsh, and they were from residents of Caldwell Flats, not love letters, but something more complex than that. They were letters of trust. Letters from people who had given money to Cecilia Marsh for safekeeping. Letters that referred to her, in terms of unmistakable affection and confidence, as the only honest bookkeeper in the county. People who had not trusted the bank in Ridgeway, which had already failed once. People who had brought their savings to Cecilia Marsh, who ran the Glass Meridian Saloon, because she was known to be careful and fair and incorruptible, and who had received in return careful notations in her ledger and her word, which they had accepted because her word had never once been broken. The wooden case contained a single document. It was a deed of trust, written in legal language that Nora had to read twice slowly to parse, establishing that the funds held by Cecilia Marsh on behalf of the named individuals were to be maintained in a specific account at a specific bank in Denver, not the bank that had failed, but a different one, and that the account number and authorization codes were recorded here, on this document, in the event that Cecilia Marsh was ever unable to act on the depositor's behalf. Beside the account number, in the same small precise hand, was a figure. Nora read it. She read it again. She set the document down on the floor of the Glass Meridian Saloon and pressed both palms flat against the boards beside her and breathed until her hands stopped trembling. The figure was $4,712. In a bank in Denver. Untouched, as far as she could determine from the document's dates, for 6 years. Belonging, by every moral and legal measure available, to the people of Caldwell Flats. She spent the next 2 days reading everything, the ledgers, the letters, the deed of trust, carefully and in order. She built a picture of Cecilia Marsh that was, for all its fragmentary quality, one of the most vivid portraits she had encountered of any person living or dead. Cecilia Marsh had come to Caldwell Flats in 1869 with a husband who died the following year of a fever and a practical education in commerce that no one had thought to ask her about because she was a woman who ran a saloon, and people who run saloons are rarely consulted about financial management. She had recognized, in the silver rush years of the early 1870s, that the people around her were accumulating savings they had nowhere safe to put, and she had offered, quietly and without ceremony, to keep those savings in trust. She had charged nothing for this service. She had kept meticulous records. She had, at some point in 1876, taken the legal step of formalizing the arrangement through a deed of trust filed with a Denver attorney, though that filing, as Nora would later discover, had been deliberately obscured in the county records by a man who had his own reasons for wanting Cecilia Marsh's financial stewardship to disappear. That man's name was Gerald Pence. He was, in 1884, the wealthiest individual in Caldwell Flats and the surrounding county, having arrived in 1877 as an agent for an Eastern mining consortium and having, by 1878, managed to acquire at deeply depressed prices the properties and claims of a number of Caldwell Flats residents who had, in that same year, found themselves suddenly in need of cash. Cash they had believed was waiting for them in Cecilia Marsh's careful ledgers, but which had, to their apparent bewilderment, become inaccessible when the Glass Meridian closed abruptly in late 1878 and Cecilia Marsh vanished from the county without explanation or farewell. The coincidence of her disappearance with the sudden cash crisis among the town's modest depositors had been noted at the time. It had been discussed. It had been permitted to harden, over 6 years, into a story in which Cecilia Marsh was the villain, the woman who had taken people's savings and fled with them, and Gerald Pence was simply a capable businessman who had been well positioned to offer distressed residents a way out of difficulty. It was Gerald Pence who had bought the Glass Meridian's debt from the county when it came up delinquent in 1879, a purchase he had presumably made in order to ensure that the building remained closed and undisturbed. It was Gerald Pence who had, Nora deduced from a letter she found among the smaller bundle, gone to considerable lengths to ensure that Cecilia Marsh's trust filing was buried in the Denver County records, misfiled under a name similar enough to cause confusion in any casual search. It was Gerald Pence who had, though this Nora could not prove from what she held in her hands, only infer from the shape of the evidence, engineered the conditions that made it impossible for Cecilia Marsh to distribute the funds she held, forcing either a crisis of trust in the community or a flight, and Nora suspected that whatever had caused Cecilia's departure had not been voluntary in any meaningful sense of the word. And it was Gerald Pence who, when the county had put the Glass Meridian up for sale rather than continuing to carry its tax debt, had assumed that no one would buy it and that it would simply be absorbed into the county's inventory and remain permanently inaccessible. He had not anticipated Nora Holt. It is unlikely that the idea of a widowed woman with $11 making the winning bid had been a scenario he'd considered. She went to see him on a Wednesday morning, 2 weeks after her purchase, dressed in her best remaining dress and carrying the leather satchel under her arm. She had spent those 2 weeks making inquiries, careful, indirect conversations with the dry goods merchant about the town's history, a longer conversation with the doctor's wife, who had a memory for detail and a contempt for Gerald Pence that she no longer bothered to conceal, and one very important visit to the postal rider who made the Ridgeway run and who, for a small consideration she could not quite afford, agreed to carry a letter for her to a law office in Denver. Pence received her in the front parlor of his house, which was the largest building in Caldwell Flats and furnished in the manner of a man who wished visitors to understand immediately that they were dealing with someone of consequence. He was a compact, prosperous-looking man of perhaps 55, with the watchful eyes of someone accustomed to knowing more than he lets on. He looked at her with polite curiosity and mild condescension, which was the look he presumably gave to most women who appeared at his door unannounced. She placed the satchel on his parlor table and opened it and took out the ledger books, one at a time, and set them in front of him. She watched his face. The politeness did not leave it entirely, but something moved behind his eyes, a rapid recalculation, the way a man's expression changes when he realizes that the card he assumed was still in the deck is sitting face up on the table in front of him. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he said that he didn't know what she thought she had found or what she thought it meant, and that she might want to be careful about making accusations she couldn't support. She told him she was not making any accusations. She was simply informing him that she had written to a law office in Denver, and that she had included in that letter the account number and authorization codes from the deed of trust, and that she had asked the attorney there to verify the status of that account and, if appropriate, to begin the process of distributing the funds it contained to the individuals named in the ledgers. She told him that she had also written a letter to the county recorder's office asking for clarification regarding a misfiled trust deed that seemed to have been entered under an incorrect name in 1876. She told him that she expected responses to both letters within the month. She gathered the ledgers back into the satchel, fastened the clasps, and wished him a pleasant morning. She understood, walking back down the road toward the glass meridian, that she had just done a dangerous thing. Pence was not a man without resources or influence. He could make her life in Caldwell Flats considerably more difficult than it already was, and it was already difficult. The repairs the building needed would cost more than she had, and she had taken on the beginnings of what amounted to a campaign against the most powerful man in the county. It was the doctor who came to her first, 2 days later, appearing at the open door of the saloon where she was working on relaying the subfloor joists with lumber salvaged from the collapsed section of ceiling. He stood in the doorway and watched her work for a moment and then said that word had gotten around about what she had found, and asked if it was true. She told him it was true. He was quiet for a moment and then he said that he had put $300 of his own savings and $200 that had belonged to his wife's mother into Cecilia Marsh's keeping, and that losing it had been a hardship he had carried for 6 years, and that if there was anything he could do to help Nora in what she was undertaking, she should name it. That was how it began. By the end of the week there were 4 men helping her with the structural repairs, working evenings and Saturday mornings, not because she had asked them to but because the town of Caldwell Flats had been holding something inside it for 6 years that had no name but felt, when you pressed your palm against it, exactly like a hollow floor, a false surface over an empty space where something real had once been. The dry goods merchant's wife brought food. The blacksmith repaired the bar's brass fixtures for nothing, working in his forge and delivering them wrapped in cloth. The rancher's daughter, who turned out to have a gift for painting, volunteered to restore the lettering on the front sign when the time came. The response from Denver arrived in 5 weeks, not the month she had estimated. The attorney confirmed that the account existed, that it was active, and that the funds, with 6 years of accumulated interest on a portion of the principal, amounted to $5,308. He confirmed that the trust deed was legally valid. He confirmed that the misfiled trust deed from 1876 had been located in the county records after a thorough search, re-indexed correctly, and that it named Cecilia Marsh's designated successor trustee in the event of her absence, a name Nora had found in the smallest of the ledgers, buried at the very back, a quiet provision made by a careful woman, the name of the Glass Meridian's owner of record. That name, in 1884, after an auction and an $11 purchase, was Nora Holt. Gerald Pence left Caldwell Flats the following spring. He did not leave dramatically or in any confrontational manner, he simply began liquidating his holdings quietly and efficiently, the way a man does when he has understood that the ground beneath him has shifted in a way that cannot be corrected by force. 2 of the properties he sold, at what the doctor observed were very reasonable prices, were properties that had formerly belonged to men whose names appeared in Cecilia Marsh's ledgers. The county recorder's office, following the re-indexing of the trust deed, began asking questions about the original misfiling. These questions did not, in the end, produce any legal proceedings, because legal proceedings in a small Colorado county in 1884 were cumbersome and expensive, and the residents of Caldwell Flats were practical people who preferred restoration to punishment. What they produced was a kind of moral clarity that Pence found, apparently, impossible to live inside of. He moved to Pueblo and, as far as anyone in Caldwell Flats ever heard, never returned. Each of the named depositors received, through the Denver attorney, a disbursement from the trust. The letters that accompanied those disbursements were written in Nora's hand, because she was the successor trustee and it was her responsibility, but they spoke of Cecilia Marsh, of her care, her precision, her honesty, her good faith. They restored what 6 years of a false story had taken from a woman who could no longer defend her own name. No one ever found Cecilia Marsh. Nora hired an inquiry agent in Denver who looked for 18 months without result, and eventually she accepted what she suspected had been true from the beginning, that Cecilia Marsh had not fled, but had been made to disappear in one of the ways that a powerful man can make a woman disappear in 1878 without anyone asking too many questions. She could not prove this. She held it as a grief and as a reason for what she did next. What she did next was finish the Glass Meridian. Not as a saloon, the territory was drifting toward temperance in ways that made a saloon a more complicated investment than it had been, but as what the building had really always been, a place where people brought what mattered to them and trusted that it would be kept safe. She opened it in the fall of 1885 as a community hall and lending library and occasional meeting room, the downstairs refinished in clean pine and the bar counter, lovingly restored to something approaching its original beauty by 6 months of patient work with a hand plane and a set of scrapers and a great deal of linseed oil, repurposed as a reading counter along the west wall. She hung, above the door, a small painted sign that bore the building's original name, the Glass Meridian. Below it, in smaller lettering that the rancher's daughter painted with a steady hand on a mild October morning, were 4 words that Nora had chosen carefully, turning them over in her mind for weeks until they felt exactly right, in trust with care. She lived in the upper rooms for 3 more years and then, when the community hall had become solid enough to endure without her daily attention, she built herself a small house on the edge of town, using lumber she purchased herself and the joinery skills her father had given her. She built it slowly and well, the way her father had taught her to build things, without hurry and without shortcuts, and with the understanding that a thing made carefully is a form of faith, faith that the future is worth preparing for, that the people who will live inside what you build deserve your best attention even when you will never meet them. She was 41 years old when the crowd laughed at her. She was 46 when the last disbursement letter went out from Denver and the Glass Meridian reopened and the people of Caldwell Flats carried their folding chairs through its doors on an October evening and sat in a circle and talked about what they wanted their town to become. She was 83 when she died, in the small house she had built herself, and by that time the town had grown back to something like its earlier number and the Glass Meridian had held more community meetings and reading circles and winter concerts than anyone had thought to count. She left the building, in her will, to the town of Caldwell Flats, with a simple condition, that it remain open, and that admission remain free. There is a quality of attention that the world consistently undervalues. We see it in the person who looks twice where others look once, who presses a palm to a surface and listens for what is underneath rather than accepting the surface as the whole of the truth. We saw it in a cabinetmaker in Laramie who taught his daughter that floors have something to tell you if you know how to ask. We saw it in a woman who ran a saloon and built, in the years when no bank would serve the people around her, a system of trust so careful and so faithfully maintained that it survived her own absence, sealed beneath a false floor, waiting for someone with the patience to find it. And we saw it in Nora Holt, who arrived in Caldwell Flats with $11.60 and a folding rule in the lining of her skirt and the understanding, bred into her like grain into wood, that a ruined thing is simply a thing that has not yet met the right person. She did not go looking for a fortune. She went looking for somewhere to stand. What she found, in the hollow space beneath a false floor in a forgotten saloon, was not merely money, though the money mattered and was restored to those who had been robbed of it. What she found was the record of a woman who had done everything right and been erased anyway, and she understood that the truest work available to her was not to profit from that record but to complete it. To be, in some sense, what Cecilia Marsh had prepared for and not lived to see, the person who came after, who knew how to look, who did not keep what did not belong to her. That is the story of Nora Holt, and we are grateful to have told it. Thank you so much for spending this time with us today, and with Nora, and with the quiet, patient town of Caldwell Flats. If this story moved you, we hope you will share it with someone who might need to hear it right now, someone who is standing in the middle of a ruined thing and wondering whether it is worth beginning again. We believe it always is. And we have one question we'd like to leave with you, the one we always carry away from stories like this one: what is something you have written off, a place, an object, a skill, a part of yourself, that, if you looked at it again, might have more inside it than the surface suggests? We would love to hear your answer in the comments. Until next time, stay close.